The first knock was so faint I thought the wind was playing tricks. Then it came again, 3 measured raps, a pause, and 3 more. The kind of knock that didn't belong in the middle of a snowstorm, 12 miles from the nearest wagon road. I stepped to the door hand near the latch, ready for trouble. When I eased it open, the lamplight spilled onto a young woman standing there, her hair plastered to her face, with cold sweat. One bare foot sank into the drift, the other in a torn moccasin. Her dress hung in tatters, her arms wrapped tight against a wind that could cut a man to the bone. Her lips moved cracked and red. I can cook. I can clean. I can be quiet. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Boone Callahan. I was born in a timber shack at the base of the Mogollon Rim, the second of 4 brothers. My folks came west, chasing land the government promised after the war with Mexico, working hard enough to wring a living out of rocky soil and thin grass. I learned young that a man's word was worth more than a signed paper, and that neighbors could mean the difference between making it through winter and burying your stock in the spring thaw. Sundays meant hitching the team to the wagon and rattling 12 miles into town for church, rain or shine. We had little to spare, but Ma always set an extra plate in case a traveler came hungry. Life carved me into a working man before I had a chance to wonder what else there might be. Summers were long days behind a plow, winters a slow battle to keep the hearth warm and the pantry stocked. I left home at 19, worked cattle drives, cleared to New Mexico, and came back with enough saved to buy this stretch of high desert. The land isn't rich. It takes grit to keep stock fed and fence lines mended, but it's mine, and I've kept it without owing any man a dollar. That changed after the war. My younger brother never came back from a Union trench near Chattanooga, and 2 winters later, my wife Clara died of a fever that filled her lungs in a week. Since then, the house has been quiet, my days a string of chores and silence. Out here, you get used to your own company. Sometimes weeks pass without hearing another voice, and I'd learned to think of that as peace. The nearest town's growing fast, now swollen with railroad men, land speculators, and merchants. They measure life in dollars, not seasons, and think nothing of swallowing up the small spreads to make way for their schemes. I've managed to keep them at bay so far. But it's a thin line, and I've known for a while it could snap with one hard pull from the wrong quarter. That afternoon, the wind came hard off the San Francisco peaks, pushing cold into every seam of the cabin. I'd just set beans to simmer when I heard that knock, not the careless pounding of a neighbor with news, not the impatient slap of a tax collector's fist. Something slower, measured. By the time I opened the door, snow was sliding across the porch, and a stranger stood there, eyes wide and older than her years. She didn't say who she was or where she'd come from, just those 12 words. I stepped back, the door still open, the storm pressing at our heels. She stepped inside like a person who had been turned away enough times to know better than to relax too quickly. Snow clung to the frayed hem of her dress, melting in dark spots across the plank floor. I closed the door against the wind, the latch clicking into place. She didn't flinch this time, but her eyes stayed on my hands until I moved toward the stove. Without a word, I ladled beans into a tin bowl, set it on the table, and drew a chair back. She hesitated, then crossed the room with small, measured steps, as if she were feeling for traps in the floor. Her fingers curled too tightly around the spoon, but she ate slow, keeping her gaze low. Every few breaths, her head turned toward the window at the sound of the wind pressing against the shutters. The firelight made the bruises on her arms more visible now, blotches of purple and blue climbing toward her shoulders. When she finally spoke, it was little more than a whisper. "Eliza," she said. I nodded once. "Boone." The rest of the meal passed in silence, broken only by the clink of tin on wood. When she finished, she carried both bowls to the barrel by the door, rinsed them, and set them upside down to dry. She didn't ask where to sleep, just took a folded blanket from the hearth settled near the wall, where the heat from the stove reached, and wrapped herself so tightly, it seemed the wool alone was holding her together. By the time I'd hung my coat and sat on the bed to pull my boots, she was asleep, her breathing shallow and quick. Morning light came gray through frost-webbed glass. The fire had died down to embers. I stirred it back to life with kindling and 2 heavy logs. The sound made her shift under the blanket. She woke fast, eyes wide, body tense, like she'd been pulled from some bad dream. I didn't speak, just poured water into a tin cup and handed it over. She drank with both hands, wincing at the first swallow before finishing the rest. I set salt pork to fry the smell, filling the cabin. She rose slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. The tear across the neckline of her dress gaped open, but she pulled it together without looking at me. We ate at the table, and after a while she said, "Your place is far from town." I told her 12 miles west of the main road. She nodded. "You live alone?" 5 years now. She gave a short, quiet, "Good," and looked away. After the plates were cleaned, she asked, "Where do you want me?" The way she stood made it plain she meant work, not lodging. Her hands were clasped in front of her skirt, her back straight as a fence post. "You need rest," I told her. "You're not here to work." Her jaw tightened. I wasn't trying to be a burden. "You're not." That seemed to slow her, but before long she was sweeping the floor anyway. Snow had begun to fall again by mid-morning, fine and steady. I asked where she'd come from. She stopped wiping the counter, stared at the rag in her hand. "South," she said. "Around Prescott. Had people there. My stepbrothers. They sold me. Traded me for a mule and a saddle." Her voice was flat without surprise, like she'd said it too many times in her head already. I didn't ask why. The answer was in the marks on her arms and the way she kept her shoulders drawn in. She glanced up. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're wondering." I shook my head. "Wasn't." That seemed to ease something in her face just a fraction. I pulled on my coat to check the livestock, told her a storm was coming. "I'll come," she said. "You can't work in that dress," I answered. She looked down at herself, at the torn skirt and bare leg, where the fabric had split, then lifted her chin. "Show me where the needle is." By the time I stepped back inside from the barn, snow crusted on my hat brim, she'd stitched a coarse patch across the worst of the tear. The neckline was drawn tighter, though the cloth still bore its frays. She was at the stove now, sleeves rolled past her elbows, stirring a pot. "I found some cornmeal," she said. "Hope you don't mind." I sat at the table. "Don't matter." She brought over cornbread beans and a bit of molasses from a jar I'd near forgotten. "You always keep this place this clean?" she asked as we ate. "Clean enough to keep mice away," I said. "Not like this." She gave a tight nod. "Helps me doing things." We finished in quiet, the air warmer now than it had been since she arrived. That afternoon we worked side by side without speaking much. She scrubbed the hearth and soaked the kettle. I fixed the hinge on the back door. Once I caught her standing at the window, looking out toward the ridge. "Something out there?" I asked. She shook her head. "Just thinking. If they come looking for me, you won't hand me back, will you?" I kept my eyes on the snowfield beyond the barn. "No one comes this far. If they do, they'll answer to me." Her shoulders eased slightly and she turned back to her work. When night came, she chose the same place by the fire. But this time she lay down without that stiff watchfulness in her eyes. I stretched out on the bed, the wind outside dropping to a low murmur. The last thing I saw before sleep was her face in the firelight, calm enough to rest. The next day brought a sky the color of tin, the cold sharp enough to sting your lungs. Snow had drifted high against the barn door, and it took my shoulder to force it open. Inside, the animals were restless but sound. Back at the cabin, she was barefoot on the plank floor, stirring a pan of bacon ends with cornmeal. She'd stitched another seam in her skirt and moved without that guarded pause in each step. "You ever work on a ranch?" I asked, as she set a plate down. "No, just kitchens and back rooms," she said. "They never taught me to ride. I wasn't meant to go far." She said it without looking down, and I understood what she meant. "You're not kept here," I told her. "I know," she said quickly, and the way she held my eyes told me she needed that settled. We spent the day shoring up the barn roof. She fetched wood without being told, held the ladder steady while I braced new planks. By the time we came inside, her shoulders were tight from the work. I set a basin of warm water on the table. "You're sore?" She nodded. "Just my shoulders can't reach." I moved slow, sat behind her, and pressed the warm cloth to her skin. The bruises there were deep blue shading into yellow. She let out a breath she seemed not to know she'd been holding. When I finished, I pulled her coat back up over her shoulders. She turned her hazel eyes meeting mine without flinching. Her hand came up, resting light on mine for a moment before she walked to the hearth. That night, before she closed her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the wind was building again, carrying the promise of more snow. I knew by morning the drifts would be higher, the world smaller, and whatever had brought her here might not be finished yet. The snow kept falling through the night, soft enough to muffle every sound outside. By morning, the light through the windows was pale and colorless, the frost reaching up the glass like spider veins. I forced the barn door open against a waist-high drift and checked the stock. The mules shifted restlessly in their stalls, snorting steam into the cold air, but they had feed and shelter enough to keep through the day. When I came back inside, Eliza was at the stove in her bare feet, the sleeves of her patched dress pushed above her elbows. She'd found bacon ends at the bottom of a tin and was frying them with cornmeal. She didn't speak when the door shut behind me, just gave a small nod and turned back to the pan. The neckline of her dress still bore its frays, but she'd drawn it tighter across her chest, the stitching neat and deliberate. We ate at the table without much talk. I asked if she'd ever worked on a ranch. She said no, only kitchens and back rooms, and added that she'd never been taught to ride. "I wasn't meant to go far," she said, looking straight at me. I told her she wasn't kept here. She answered quick, I know, like she needed that. Settled before the moment passed. The wind had eased by midday, though the snow was still deep. We walked to the barn together. She carried my coat draped over her shoulders, the hem nearly to her ankles, the sleeves falling past her hands. She steadied the ladder while I braced fresh planks along the roof beams. Now and then she brought over nails without being asked. It was a quiet sort of help. No wasted movement, no words unless they were needed. By the time we came inside, the light was fading. She moved stiffly, her shoulders drawn up from the cold and the work. I filled a basin with warm water and set it on the table. "You're sore," I said. She nodded once. "Just my shoulders can't reach." I pulled a chair behind her and dipped the rag. The bruises stood out dark against her skin, the kind that had been there a while. When the warm cloth touched, she let out a slow breath, her hands resting in her lap. When I was done, I pulled the coat back up over her shoulders. She turned to face me, her eyes meeting mine without flinching. Her hand came up, resting light on mine for a moment before she stepped away to the hearth. That night, she lay near the fire again, but she faced me this time, her breathing even. Just before her eyes closed, she whispered, "Thank you." The next few days, the storm thinned, but didn't quit. Snow covered the ridge and lay heavy on the fence rails. Inside, we found a rhythm without speaking much about it. She was up before me most mornings, coaxing the fire back and setting a pot to boil. I learned the sound of her steps on the plank floor, the soft scrape of a spoon against tin, the quiet rustle of her skirt as she moved around the cabin. Her mended dress fit closer now, tied at the waist with a strip of cloth she'd sewn into a sash. The slit up the side caught at her thigh when she crouched to tend the fire. I didn't stare, but I noticed, and she never seemed to catch me looking. That morning we worked the fence line behind the barn, where the wind had knocked down 3 posts. She held the stakes while I drove them in her hands, reddening in the cold. "You've done this before?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not hard if someone shows you." We ate by the fire that evening, boiled potatoes and venison from the cellar. She sat close enough that her knee brushed mine. She didn't move away. After supper, I stepped outside for more wood. When I came back, she was brushing out her hair, long and dark, the firelight catching the waves. The neckline of her dress had slipped to bare the top of her shoulder. Whether it was by accident or not, she didn't cover it right away. I turned to hang my coat, giving her the space. Later, I brought 2 mugs of warm water to the hearth. She set hers down after a sip, then turned to me. "I used to think no man could touch me without wanting to own me," she said. "But you haven't." I told her that wasn't why I'd let her in. She nodded. "That's why I'm still here." She reached for my hand, then fingers resting over it without pulling away. I turned my palm to meet hers, our fingers barely touching. She leaned against me, her head near my shoulder, her breath warm through my shirt. She looked up after a while, her eyes steady. The kiss, when it came, was slow and quiet, without urgency. When we pulled apart, she rested her head against me again, and we stayed that way until the fire burned low. That night, she didn't bed down by the hearth. She stood by the edge of my bed and said, "I don't want to sleep alone." I moved over, and she lay down beside me, her back against my chest. We didn't speak, but after a while her hand found mine under the blanket, and she held it until she fell asleep. By the time the sun rose, the wind had died, and the sky was a sharp blue over the snowfields. The fire still glowed in the hearth, and for the first time in a long while the cabin didn't feel empty. But I knew the high country didn't keep still for long, and whatever had driven her to my door might yet find its way across the drifts. The snow stayed deep, but the days began to stretch. The air still bit at your face when you stepped outside, yet there was more light to work by. Eliza moved through the cabin without the caution she'd had that first week. She was up before me most mornings, tying her mended dress with that makeshift sash, coaxing the fire back to life, and setting coffee to boil. I found myself listening for those sounds, the scrape of the pot, the soft fall of her steps across the planks. We set to mending the south fence line together. The rails had loosened under the weight of the last storm, and the ground was still half frozen. She wore my coat again, sleeves rolled to keep her hands free. When I swung the hammer, she held each post steady, her fingers red from the cold, but not shaking. She worked without asking what came next, finding the next brace, bringing nails before I called for them. The quiet between us was steady, not strained. That evening, the smell of stew filled the cabin. She'd used the last of the carrots and a slab of venison from the cellar. We ate close to the fire, her knee brushing mine once under the table. She didn't move away, and neither did I. After supper, she cleared the bowls, and I went out to bring in more wood. When I stepped back inside, she was brushing her hair again, the long strands falling past her shoulders in the firelight. The neckline of her dress slipped slightly as she leaned forward. She didn't rush to fix it, and I turned to hang my coat without a word. Later, I brought 2 mugs of warm water to the hearth. She set hers down after a sip, then looked at me. "I used to think no man could touch me without wanting to keep me," she said. "But you haven't?" I told her that wasn't why I'd opened the door that night. She nodded. "That's why I'm still here." Her hand found mine, the touch light but sure. I turned my palm to meet hers, our fingers resting together. She leaned against me, her head near my shoulder. The only sound was the crackle of the logs. After a while, she lifted her face toward mine. The kiss came without hesitation, slow and quiet. When we drew apart, she stayed close, her cheek against my shirt. That night, she didn't bed down by the fire. She stood beside my bed instead. "I don't want to sleep alone," she said. I moved over, and she lay down beside me, her back against my chest. Her hand found mine under the blanket, and we stayed like that until morning. When I woke, the fire still glowed, and the wind outside had dropped to a low hum. Her breathing was steady, her back warm against me. I lay there longer than usual before easing out of bed to stoke the fire. She joined me at the table a few minutes later, slipping into one of my flannel shirts over her dress. The sleeves swallowed her hands, but she didn't seem to mind. Over the next days, the thaw began in small ways. The ridge snow broke into rivulets that ran toward the creek bed. The barn roof shed its icy load. Eliza's steps outside grew surer, and her shoulders stayed straight when she met my eyes. One afternoon, we finished bracing the last section of fence and stood side by side looking over the open field. She had a streak of mud across her cheek, and she smiled faintly when she caught me noticing. Back in the cabin, she moved slower that evening. I set a basin of warm water by the table, but she waved it off. "Just tired," she said. I nodded, letting her be. After supper, she sat near the fire with her legs curled under her, mending a tear in my work shirt. Her fingers moved quick and steady, the needle catching in the light. I worked on shaping a new handle for the shovel, glancing up now and then to watch her concentration. When she finished, she folded the shirt neatly and set it aside. "You were in the war?" she asked. I told her I had been. "Union?" I nodded. "Lose someone?" "My brother." She sat quiet for a moment before saying, "I lost my mother young, my father too. Stepbrothers after that. They made things worse." She met my eyes, her voice even. I told them I'd cook clean work. They didn't care. She didn't cry when she said it. Her gaze stayed steady, though the firelight caught the line of her jaw. I didn't answer right away, just reached for the log pile and set another on the flames. When I looked back, she was still watching me. "You've got nowhere to go?" I asked. "Not anymore," she said. Her fingers smoothed the edge of the blanket over her lap. "I'm not asking to stay forever. Just not to be pushed out. Not yet." I got up and crossed to the corner, bringing back the heavy buffalo hide blanket. I handed it to her without a word. She unfolded it across her lap and pulled it around her shoulders. Her eyes didn't leave mine, and she gave a small nod. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters. I knew weather like that could turn quick, and it wasn't only storms a man had to be ready for. By the next week, the ridge ice had begun to soften under a warmer sun. The creek bed still lay frozen, but thin water lines showed where the thaw was working its way down. Each day, Eliza moved with more purpose, no longer measuring every step or glance. She was still quiet, but it was a quiet that belonged to choice, not fear. One morning, I found her outside stacking kindling against the wall, her skirts pinned at the sides so they wouldn't drag in the snow. She'd already swept the porch clear and laid my tools in order on the bench. "You're up early?" I said. She straightened, a faint smile in her eyes. Figured I'd get ahead of the day. Inside, she had coffee ready, strong enough to push the cold out of a man's bones. We spent the morning hauling in the last of the hay bales from the lean-to before the weather could turn again. She pulled the sled rope without complaint, boots slipping on the packed snow, her breath steady. When I offered to take the lead, she shook her head. "I've got it." By the time we'd finished, her cheeks were flushed from the work. Over supper, she mentioned planting once the ground was ready. "A small garden against the south wall," she said. "Potatoes, beans, maybe onions, if we can keep the rabbits out." I told her it could be done, though it would mean mending that part of the fence. She nodded, already turning the idea over in her mind. And a few hens in the barn, fresh eggs make a big difference. The next morning, I was repairing a loose board near the stall, when she came in with a pail of warm water. She set it down beside me and crouched her hand brushing against mine as she passed a handful of nails. "You've got a way of keeping things working," she said. I looked at her, the sunlight from the loft window catching the gold in her hair. "Takes both of us now." She didn't answer, but her eyes held mine a moment longer before she moved to sweep out the feed alley. That evening, the wind shifted, bringing the smell of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the ridge. Eliza noticed it too. She paused at the window, her hand resting on the sill. "Think someone's out there?" she asked. I shook my head, probably just the wind carrying from the valley. But I checked the rifle by the door all the same. She watched without comment, then went back to stirring the pot on the stove. After supper, she joined me by the fire. She'd brought over the buffalo hide blanket and settled in close. "When spring comes," she said, "I want to make this place more than a stopover. I don't want to drift anymore." I told her she was already part of it. But she shook her head. "I mean really part of it, something we build together." The days that followed took on a steadier shape. We patched the barn door where the bottom panel had warped from ice. She scrubbed the shelves in the cellar and sorted what was left of the winter stores. I noticed her finding small ways to make the cabin hers, a folded cloth over the table, a tin cup set aside for her coffee, the blanket she favored draped over the chair by the hearth. One night after the dishes were cleaned and the fire banked, she stood beside me with that look she'd had before, not unsure, just deliberate. "I want you to touch me again," she said quietly. "Only if you want to." I rose, set my hand at her waist, and let her guide the rest. There was nothing hurried in it, no bargain struck, only what was given freely. By the end of the week, the snow had pulled back from the fence line, leaving mud and patches of dry grass. The mornings were still cold, but the sun carried more weight. We started clearing the south edge where the garden would go. Eliza worked with her sleeves rolled, a handkerchief tied at her hairline. She moved the rocks into a neat pile and smoothed the soil with the side of her boot. "This will do," she said, straightening. "It'll do fine." That afternoon she paused while hanging laundry, one hand pressed lightly against her belly. I asked if she was all right. She nodded, though her eyes held something unspoken. Later, while I was planning a board for the chicken coop, she came to the barn doorway. "I'm late," she said simply. I set the tool aside and stepped toward her. "You sure? Not yet, but it feels like it." She stood there without flinching, as if testing whether I'd turn away. "I'm not asking anything from you," she said. "I just didn't want to keep it to myself." I told her I wasn't the sort to walk away. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it." She let out a slow breath and nodded. That night she curled against me in bed, her arm across my chest. The next morning the frost was light on the ground, and the sky had that pale look it gets before a thaw sets in. I caught sight of her in the yard, carrying the wash basket toward the line, her skirt catching the breeze. It struck me how far she'd come from that first night on the porch, and how far we might still have to go. By early March, the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes, leaving dark, wet earth underfoot. The air carried a hint of thaw, though the night still dropped below freezing. Eliza's belly had begun to show, rounding just enough to change the way she carried herself. She didn't hide it, and she didn't slow more than she had to. We'd been working on clearing a space behind the shed where the coop would stand. She hauled armfuls of scrap wood from the barn, while I set posts into the softening ground. The smell of damp earth mixed with the sharp scent of cut pine. She paused now, and then resting her hand against the small of her back. But she never let me take the heavier work without protest. "I can still pull my share," she said more than once. Inside, the cabin had taken on a lived-in order that wasn't there before. She'd set a folded cloth over the table and kept the shelves stocked with what she'd put by: jars of beans, strips of dried meat, a crock of lard sealed in the cool corner. My shirts came back to their peg, mended, my boots cleaned of mud without my asking. It wasn't fuss. It was the rhythm of someone who meant to stay. One warm afternoon, I came back from checking the upper fence to find her in the barn, sweeping the stall we'd cleared for a goat later in the season. Her hair had come loose, falling over her shoulders, and her dress hung low at the front, from where she'd leaned over the broom. She stopped when she saw me leaning the handle against the wall. "You're not supposed to be lifting," I said. She smiled faintly. "I'm not lifting, I'm pushing." I told her I'd been working on something and pulled back the canvas in the corner. The cradle stood there in the half-light, simple, sturdy, sanded smooth. She stepped close, her fingers brushing the edge. "You made this?" I nodded. Didn't think I needed to ask. Her eyes shone without tears, her voice steady. "You've never asked me to be yours," she said. "You've never said it." I told her I figured she'd already chosen. She stepped nearer, resting her hands against my chest. I did. I still am. That night she lay beside me with my hand over her stomach. "I want her to have your eyes," she murmured. I asked her. She nodded. "I feel it. A girl strong, quiet like you, stubborn like me." I told her when she was old enough I'd teach her how to build, and she could teach her how to stay. The next weeks moved with the slow weight of spring breaking open. The creek began to run again, fed by snow melt from the ridge. Birds came back to the rafters of the barn, gathering bits of straw for their nests. Eliza planted potatoes in a narrow strip along the south wall, her skirts brushing the turned earth as she bent. I worked the fence, replacing warped rails with fresh-cut pine. We stopped for water under the same sky, side by side, hands dirty from work that meant something to both of us. She grew heavier by the day, her steps measured but steady. I caught her once standing in the doorway, with a hand over her belly, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. She didn't say what was on her mind, and I didn't press. That night she set supper on the table and sat across from me, her eyes holding mine longer than usual. "You be all right with a child here?" she asked. I told her she wouldn't be raising it alone. She nodded once and went back to her stew, but I could see the tightness in her shoulders ease. We spent a morning cutting rails for the last stretch of fencing. I carried them down from the slope while she stacked them where they'd be easy to reach. The air was warm enough to work without a coat, and the smell of pitch hung on our hands. When we finished, she leaned against the fence post, catching her breath. "Feels good," she said. I agreed. It felt like something solid, something built to last. That evening, as the fire burned low, she sat on the edge of the bed in nothing but my flannel shirt. "I want you to touch me," she said. "Not because I owe it, because I want to." There was no rush in the way she drew me close, no bargaining in the way she pressed her lips to mine. Outside, the night was still, the wind gone from the ridge. Inside, the only sound was the slow, even creak of the bed and the crackle of the last log on the fire. By the time we lay quiet again, her head on my chest, the air had the weight of something that would carry us into whatever came next. The wind shifted warm that morning, carrying the smell of sage from the flats and the faint sweetness of early blossoms along the creek. Eliza moved slower now, her belly full and heavy under her dress, but her steps were steady. I saddled the bay to ride into town for supplies, leaving her by the doorway with a basket of mending in her lap. She told me not to linger. Main Street was busy for a weekday. Wagons rattled over the packed dirt, and the clink of a blacksmith's hammer rang from the far end. I tied off in front of Lawson's store and stepped inside, the air thick with coffee and kerosene. Folks glanced up when I entered, some offering nods, others letting their eyes linger too long. News traveled quick out here, and I knew without asking that our quiet life hadn't stayed ours. At the counter, Amos Lawson rang up my flour, sugar, and lamp oil. He hesitated before adding a bolt of soft cotton cloth I'd picked for Eliza. "Heard tell you got company out your way," he said low, as if the walls might hear. I told him I had, and that she was under my roof because I meant it that way. He only nodded, but his eyes said more than his mouth would. When I stepped back outside, a rider I didn't know slowed his horse near me. He was lean, maybe in his 40s, with a worn hat pulled low. "Name's Whit Danner," he said. "Been sent from Prescott with word for the woman staying with you." He handed me a folded paper, the seal broken and the edges creased. I asked who sent it. He just shook his head. Didn't ask, didn't care. My job was to bring it. The ride home felt longer than the miles. The note sat in my coat pocket, light as air, but heavy all the same. Eliza was on the porch when I returned, her sewing basket closed at her feet. She looked from my face to the paper I held. Without speaking, she reached for it. Her hands were steady as she unfolded it, but her eyes moved quick over the words. I saw her mouth press tight before she folded it again. "It's nothing," she said, standing to go inside. But her shoulders were drawn up, and her steps held a stiffness I hadn't seen in months. That evening, while the fire burned low, she told me pieces of it. Someone from the place she'd left behind wanted her to return, claiming it was her duty. She didn't say who, and I didn't press. "I'm not going," she said finally, her voice flat. "Not now. Not ever." The next day, I found her in the barn, brushing the bay, the note tucked into a crack in the wall. I asked if she wanted me to burn it. She looked at me for a long moment before nodding. I tossed it into the stove, watching the edges curl and blacken. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered over the ridge, and the air felt close. Eliza stayed inside, sorting jars in the pantry, while I brought in more wood. Near dusk, hoofbeats sounded on the road, more than one horse moving steady. I stepped onto the porch as 3 riders came into view, their coats dark with dust, their eyes fixed on the cabin. They reined in short of the gate. The one in front, a broad man with a deep-set scowl, called out, "We're here for the woman." His voice carried without strain. Eliza came to the doorway behind me, her hand resting on the frame. "You're not taking her," I said. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "That's not for you to decide, Callahan." His 2 companions shifted in their saddles, hands near the butts of their pistols. I kept mine loose at my sides, but ready. Eliza stepped forward until she stood beside me. "You can tell whoever sent you that I'm not leaving," she said. Her voice was steady, but I felt the faint tremor in her hand. The man studied her a moment, then spat in the dirt. "We'll be back," he said, swinging into his saddle. The 3 of them turned and rode off into the coming dark. We stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the wind. Inside, the lantern light threw long shadows across the floor. Neither of us spoke as I checked the rifle and set it by the door. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. The night after the riders left was long and still. Eliza sat by the stove, her hands resting on the swell of her belly, while I kept the rifle across my knees. The fire's glow painted her face in soft gold, but her eyes stayed on the door. Neither of us slept much. By morning, word had spread. Sheriff Albee rode out from town, a 2nd horse in tow. He said the judge was holding a hearing in Prescott and wanted Eliza's side heard under the law, not from the mouths of men sent to fetch her. She agreed to go on the condition I ride with her. The trip took 2 days, the trail rough with spring runoff. In Prescott, the courthouse stood solid against the wind, its tall windows catching the late sun. Inside, the room smelled of pine boards and lamp oil. The men who'd come to our door sat stiff on one bench, hats in their hands. The judge, an older man with silver hair, listened while Eliza spoke plain and steady. She told what had been done to her and why she would not return. When she finished, the judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. His ruling was clear: she was free to stay where she chose, and any man who tried to force her back would answer to the law. The men left without a word, their boots loud against the floorboards. That evening, we stayed in a small room above the livery. Eliza stood by the window, looking out at the lights in the street. "It's over," she said quietly. I knew she meant more than the hearing. We rode home the next day under a sky wide and blue. The land opened before us, the air warm with the smell of mesquite. When our cabin came into view, Eliza's hand found mine where it rested on the saddle horn. Life didn't change all at once. There was still work to do, fences to mend, stock to tend, a child soon to welcome. But the shadow that had followed her was gone. In its place was something steadier, stronger. Out here, folks talk about justice like it's a thing you can hold in your hand. I've learned it's quieter than that, more like a door that stays closed to the wrong people and open to the right ones. If you've walked a long road to find where you belong, you'll understand why we never looked back. And if you know someone still on that road, maybe you'll be the one who helps them get there.